You read the title, you know what we're getting up to today. If you can't hear it in my voice, I feel as if I have been sick for the entirety of December, and now, just when I had like 2 days of recovery, I'm down bad again. I do want to stop bed rotting though, so I'm forcing myself to get up and do some kind of creative exercise, and I've had this idea for a while. I did see that Sarah Labrat made a painting for her book, and I have this scene in my head that I just want to capture on canvas. So that is what we are doing today. But I am going to be a little bit crazier because I didn't think you should just sit and watch a speed painting with some music. So I've decided that I'm going to read to you my first chapter. Now, this is crazy for a few reasons. The first is that this is technically only the first round of revisions that I've done on this chapter. If you don't count all of the edits and whatnot that I did in October when I initially wrote it. So, will it be changing? Absolutely. The second reason that this is quite possibly a really silly thing to do is I want to pursue traditional publishing, which I don't know if I've ever said that on here before, but yes, I want to pursue traditional. So, there is not a timeline for this book, so I am very well aware that I will be teasing you with this, with absolutely no plan or day when you will be able to get your hands on the entire thing. So, sorry, not sorry. Oh, and if you are new here, hi, hello, I'm Caitlin. I am a writer documenting my entire process to becoming a published author, and I just finished writing the first draft of my very first book ever. If you like My Lady Jane or Renegade Nell, you might like my novel Sir Callan Gray's Final Lament. It's a soft fantasy that follows a disgraced medieval knight and the time-traveling journalist who is trying to discover the truth behind his exiling. The chapter that I'm going to be sharing today is technically chapter 3, but it is the first chapter in Callan's perspective because my author is also a character and she has 2 chapters before this. But this has been one of my favorite chapters to write, so I'm really excited to share it with you today. Okay, let's go do the thing. Chapter 1. Exile looks rather good on me. Where shall I begin to tell a tale of such woe as mine? For it is quite woeful indeed. I think it only natural to start at the beginning. To my misfortune, I was born a 3rd son. No one, not even kings, maybe especially kings, have need for a 3rd son. It is tragically boring how unlike my brothers I am, and while it is true that growing up we had the same wet nurses and attended the same rhetorics, my brothers spent the royal games of hunt with our father as a means to prepare their bodies for fighting and strategize their minds for tactics of war, and I was using those same lessons as an excuse to slink away for a less respectable sort of exercise of the body. To this day, I shudder at the memory of Nona having caught me in the stables in such a state. She was practically a second mother. Or, more specifically, the additional rules that were tacked on to her endless list of things princes should be above doing. Crying, cursing, copulating, to name a few. No, this doesn't seem the right beginning. I shall start over. The birthplace of my ending should do fine, don't you think? I was late. Tragically late. I would like to report that it was my own fault, but considering my history with tardiness and the simple fact that anyone who knew me at all would know I would not want to attend this particular coup, my father should have had his people add some padding to the schedule. In my defense, I did try. I couldn't help that the day got away from me. Can you honestly say that if you had received a letter, the first correspondence from your father in 10 years, complete with the royal wax seal and indentation of the family ring, requesting your presence urgently by the next morning, that you wouldn't have stopped to wander about the castle gardens first? Fine, but I am big enough to admit that I had wanted to explore my own childhood stomping grounds, and when you are ready to concede to having also done the same, I will help you off that high horse. Besides, if you must know, I was curious to see if any of the servants had yet to shave down a certain phallic illustration from my father's stone likeness in the garden. They had not. But it had become overcome with moss, and I was simply being a dutiful son by undoing time's green thumb. And so, by the time I remembered father's heavy-handed warning, it had been too late. The briefing hall was a room that I had tried to avoid at all costs, considering the only times I was there was when I was commanded to it and chastised for things outside of my control. To say that it would have been better suited as a hallway was an understatement. Why would anyone want to walk 60 paces in one direction and only 10 in the other? And not even a full 10, as half the space was occupied by the longest slab of table in the history of ever. I mean, that must have been the world's oldest tree, and we just chopped it down, lacquered it, and forced the world's oldest dignitaries to sit around it and be grateful they weren't trees themselves. Not to mention the obscene columned wall of windows, which is all good and well if you needed the light, and I suppose if you were to be reading maps and balancing trade taxes. Okay, I see the point. But we can both agree that it is for the best that my father believed me to be more inclined to knighthood than to architecture, as I clearly did not possess the knack for it, though the court is still out on whether or not I am capable of being a knight, which is, unfortunately, the reason I had been called to this very frustrating room in the first place. See, things outside of my control. The first thing I saw when I pushed through the unnecessarily heavy doors was not my father or my commanding officer, Lord Otis. It was my eldest brother, Conan, who had stood at the sound of my, albeit late, entrance. And I was struck by the sight of him. I had known, of course, that our time apart would change us. It had certainly changed me, judging by the look I received from him in turn. But when I had left, Conan was already a man in my eyes, 19 and the perfect heir to the crown. But now he was fit to be king. Long gone were the gangly limbs I had known since childhood, replaced by the robust, muscular makings of a warrior. He was not particularly towering, though my inkling of having surpassed him in height was now proven true, but the space he claimed was shocking. The way it ebbed and flowed around him with the singular act of squaring his shoulders. But the most shocking change of all was his hair. There was not a member of court that did not know of Conan's daily battle with his valet on this simple matter. While still long and curling out like protruding horns near the shortest layers, it was at least slicked back. And I was surprised that somehow, somewhere along the way, Tarek had finally won. My heart ached at the realization that I had not been there when it had happened. The opportunities for merciless teasing overshadowed by the awareness of just how many days, moments, meanings I had missed. Conan's expression changed from one of appraising uncertainty for the now man that stood before him to one of pure joy, completely softening him back into that familiar version of him I used to know. He clapped his hands together in a great show and said, "You see, Father, I knew Cal would make it." It shouldn't have surprised me that Conan would argue on my behalf, considering he had always taken that lead, and I was reminded of childish escapades that involved more mud than seemed plausible, but I couldn't help the smile that parted my lips at this small kindness, as I had forgotten just how good he was at handing those out without a second's notice. Unfortunately, this seemed to be one of those rare instances that my father's spirits were not uplifted by the prospect of enacting punishment for my faults. One look at his hardened expression that not even my eldest brother had managed to soften, and I knew there was only one way for this to end. Tragedy. That is, unless I made a run for it, which I was not above doing at that exact moment, if it weren't for the doors closing behind me, forcing me forward into the room to where my father was heading the table. Each leaden step was amplified in the silence, boot heels clicking like the countdown for the executioner's blade. I forced my eyes to remain on my father's grave face, though he didn't spare me the decency of returning the look. Then Conan stepped in front of me, putting himself between us. His hand found my shoulder urgently squeezing, and for a flickering moment I swear I saw something like pity in his expression. But it firmed into a look of brotherly wisdom he had years to perfect, and I had all but forgotten it by the time he stepped aside. When I had addressed my father, it was with a perfunctory bow, and while spent staring at the toe of my boot, I dug deep within to the pits of my very essence and tried for a light-hearted tone. "My apologies, Father. I lost track of the day. I was out riding." "Oh, really? Whom?" Kiernan had not stood. Perhaps it was too much effort for the spare air. He sat, as ever, with his arms folded across his chest next to our father, so very obedient. My stomach lurched, and I was sure that my cheeks were burning as I straightened up. Oh, how I was always made to feel like such a child in this room. "Sit down, Callan," my father exhaled, and though his hand swept out as an afterthought, it was in order. I moved around him to fill an empty chair at the table, not at either of his sides, of course, but somewhere down the middle, but he did not wait until I seated myself to speak, and what little hope I had had that the distance might soften his volume was abandoned the moment he dismissed our audience. The chair scraped against the floor, and I held my breath as Kiernan led Lord Otis out of the room, throwing a backward sneer in my direction that only I managed to catch. I watched the back of Conan's head, knowing that he couldn't risk arguing on my behalf again, but allowing that small part of me to hope that he would. No, Conan did not stay. He let the door close behind him, and with it went my saving grace. Well, here she is in all of her glory. I had a lot of fun painting this, and it was surprisingly helpful. Up until this point, I have struggled with seeing the third act as clearly as I do the first, and I was kind of shocked at how this took form. This is the scene where Callan goes to face the beast, which is obviously very symbolic of him facing his past mistakes, and it's not a spoiler to say that just like everything else in his life, this does not go according to plan. I hope you enjoyed the reading of my first chapter, and like I said, everything is subject to change. But I'm feeling very confident in where the story is now headed, and I feel like Callan's voice is really strong already. And even though he's insufferable, you can't help but love him right away. And if not love, at least want to see him get his dues. I've got some fun videos like this one in the works, so if you had a good time and want to see more like it from me, please consider liking and subscribing. There's even more of me in the description below: newsletter, author website, lit mag, book cover design services, all the fun stuff. If you want to directly support my dream, you can also buy me a coffee on my Ko-fi page. I'll see you in the next one. Happy writing.